When night falls, and the final sounds of a long day gradually fade away, history often reveals itself in a very different way. It is no longer a sequence of rigid dates, no longer the noise of clamorous battles, but fragile moments instead. Moments in which a single human being, in silence, begins to grow larger than his own age. France, at the end of the 18th century, was such a place. The crown had fallen, old laws had shattered, and the revolution, after the echo of its thunderous cries, had left behind only a long, lingering exhaustion. People no longer dreamed of freedom, they dreamed of order. Ideals were no longer their longing. They simply wished for a hand steady enough to keep society from collapsing once again. It was within this void that Napoleon Bonaparte appeared. He did not enter history as a savior, nor did he claim to be the heir of the revolution. He arrived as a solution, cold, efficient, and impatient with chaos. Napoleon did not merely change the fate of France. He changed the way all of Europe understood power, war, and the state itself. He proved that a single individual, if fast enough and decisive enough, could replace an entire revolution. This story, on Deep Sleep of Power, will be told slowly, as a whisper meant for the late hours of the night. Here, power does not roar. It seeps in, persuades, and gently lulls the listener into sleep through the quiet lessons of history. If you find peace in this rhythm of storytelling, please support the channel so that these stories of power may continue to be told through the night. And before we journey deeper into Napoleon's path, leave a comment below. Whose story would you like to hear next? Who, in your eyes, once possessed the strength to make history change its course? Now, as breathing slows and the night settles in, we begin where Napoleon himself began, not at the center of France, but at its very margins. There are people who, from the moment they are born, never fully belong to any one place. Not because they wander, but because their homeland itself hangs suspended, between maps, between collective memories, between identities that have yet to settle. Napoleon Bonaparte was born into such circumstances, not at the heart of France, but at its edge, on an island only recently annexed, where history itself had not yet decided whether it was victor or vanquished. Corsica, at the end of the 18th century, was not France in the spiritual sense. It was a wound still aching from a forced union. Corsicans spoke Italian more than French, preserved local traditions more than the laws of Paris, and carried within them the bitter memory of being compelled to become citizens of a nation they had never freely chosen. Napoleon was born into this atmosphere, into a poor minor noble family, bearing an Italian surname, speaking French with a foreign accent, and growing up with the quiet awareness that he belonged to a place that did not truly want him. Napoleon's childhood lacked the serenity of children born at the center of power. It was shaped early by a sense of inadequacy, the inadequacy of an outsider. In the eyes of France, Corsica was a wild land. In the eyes of Corsica, families like the Bonapartes were seen as too pro-French. Caught between these two perspectives, Napoleon learned to stand alone. No community offered complete shelter, no identity felt whole. And from that void, a profound need gradually took shape. The need to prove one's worth through ability, not through birth. When he was sent to the mainland to study, Napoleon carried with him not only his belongings, but also a deep sense of alienation. To boys who were French by blood, who spoke flawless Parisian French, he was the one with the strange name, the thick accent, the one who did not grasp the subtle social codes of the upper classes. Contempt was not always spoken aloud, but it lived in glances, in distance, in thin smiles. Napoleon did not answer with words. He remembered, he observed, and he retreated into his inner world, where ambition began to grow in silence. What matters here is not personal pain, but the way it shaped his thinking. Napoleon understood early that, in a stratified society, acceptance does not come from asking. It comes from forcing recognition, and to achieve that, one needs something that rises above lineage and accent, efficiency, results, success that cannot be denied. From a very young age, he did not dream of being loved. He dreamed of becoming impossible to ignore. Corsica, in Napoleon's memory, was therefore more than a homeland. It was his first lesson in power. The lesson is that identity can be a burden if it is not accompanied by strength. The lesson that those born on the margins, if they refuse to accept that position, must learn to climb toward the center by their own path, faster, more decisively, and with less mercy than those already standing there. When France entered the unstable years of the Revolution, this marginal experience became a strange advantage. Napoleon felt no deep emotional loyalty to the old monarchy, but he also did not romanticize the new slogans. He looked at Paris as a machine in disrepair and believed he understood machinery better than ideals. Being born outside the center allowed him to avoid blind loyalty to any order, remaining loyal only to his own capacity to advance. And it is here, while the story is still at its earliest steps, that we begin to see the seeds of something larger. A man, born on the edge of France, raised in alienation, learned to turn distance into momentum, not to assimilate, but to surpass, not to be accepted, but to force history itself to open its doors. In the next part, as Napoleon enters the cold military schools of France, that feeling of not belonging will not disappear. It will sharpen, discipline itself, and begin to transform into a dream of power, nurtured in silence, waiting for the moment to awaken. There are losses that make no loud sound, yet leave aftershocks that last an entire lifetime. When Adam Smith's father died, while he was still very young, the world did not collapse. There were no violent upheavals, no chaotic days that followed. Everything continued as before. Mornings still arrived, ships still moved in and out of the harbor, and people still bought, sold, exchanged, and lived. Yet for a child, that absence quietly altered the way he stood in the world, not through visible grief, but through a deeper, more attentive way of listening. Adam Smith grew up in the care of his mother, a patient, resilient woman, closely bound to the surrounding community. In that small town, no one used grand words to speak of responsibility or morality. People simply did what needed to be done, helping when they could, sharing when it was necessary, and continuing with life. Within that simplicity, Smith came to recognize something essential at an early age. Human beings do not exist as isolated islands. When one link weakens, other links, imperfect as they may be, can still hold the entire network together. That experience did not lead him to believe that society is always good. It showed him only that society can become good if people do not turn away from one another. This belief was not built on abstract ideals, but on small, repeated actions. A word of concern, a quiet act of help, a presence that does not withdraw. For a child who lost his father early, this was more than comfort. It was living proof that the world, though fragile, could still be trusted. From this point, Adam Smith began to look at human beings differently, not merely as individuals pursuing their own interests, but as creatures capable of sensing the pain of others. even without fully understanding it, even without being able to carry it in their place. He observed how people behaved when there was no clear reward, when helping brought no immediate benefit, and he realized that there are actions that cannot be explained by calculation alone, yet are precisely what keeps society from falling apart. Notably, this belief did not make Adam Smith naive. On the contrary, it made him more cautious. Only those who have experienced loss truly understand the value of being supported, and only those who have been supported begin to ask a deeper question. What would happen if those bonds disappeared? If society expanded to the point where people no longer knew one another's faces, no longer directly felt one another's pain, how would trust endure? At its deepest level, this experience laid the foundation for a line of thought that would run throughout Adam Smith's life. Society is sustained not only by laws or power, but by the capacity for sympathy. When that capacity weakens, every system, no matter how efficient, becomes cold. And when people come to see one another merely as instruments, making a living can easily slide into a weary, undignified form of existence. Environment, that loneliness quickly transformed into discipline. Napoleon was not socially charming. He was not someone who knew how to win affection early on. But he possessed a quality the military schools deeply respected: concentration. He read extensively, remembered well, and most importantly, he loved structure. For a boy raised amid fractured identities, structure offered a sense of safety. Maps had clear borders, artillery followed clear rules, calculations produced clear answers. While society was a vague game filled with bias, military science and strategy were places where competence could shine in an objective way. And so, Napoleon chose a path where results could be forced to be acknowledged. Looking back, we can trace a remarkably consistent psychological thread. Napoleon was not born loving power. He loved control. His life began with a lack of control. No control over where he was born, no control over the gaze of others, no control over being labeled an outsider. Power, for him, was therefore more than ambition. It was a remedy, a way to end the feeling of being pushed aside, a way to ensure that the world no longer had the authority to decide who he was. And it is here, in these seemingly ordinary years of military schooling, that power begins as a private dream. Not loud, not fiery. It is like an ember buried deep in ash, smoldering with patience. Napoleon was not someone who displayed his emotions openly, but if we could step inside his inner world, we would find a powerful feeling: wounded pride. And that pride, when tempered by military discipline, became a cold, sharp weapon. For the storyteller, this is what makes Napoleon's story especially compelling in the spirit of deep sleep of power. Because it is not only history, it is a psychological mechanism we continue to see across eras. When an individual is denied belonging, they may try to build a world in which they are the center. And sometimes, if they are intelligent enough, resilient enough, and the era is chaotic enough, that world does not remain confined to their mind. It spills outward, becoming politics, becoming war, becoming a new order. But the story has not yet entered the storm. The air is only beginning to gather. In the next part, as France starts to convulse under the revolution, as the old order collapses and spaces of power open like unguarded doors, the boy who belonged nowhere will see what few dare to see. That chaos is not only tragedy. Sometimes chaos is an opportunity. And perhaps it is in that moment that Napoleon's private dream will finally find a stage wide enough to become history. There are moments in history when the world does not change through grand decisions, but through the quiet exhaustion of human beings. The French Revolution, when viewed from a distance, is often told as an epic of liberty and equality. But if one listens long enough, within the slow breathing of that era, another sound emerges, the sound of fatigue. Fatigue from hunger, from injustice, from promises repeated so many times that people no longer have the strength to believe in them. When the revolution erupted, Napoleon Bonaparte did not stand in public squares shouting slogans. He did not write fiery manifestos, nor did he dream of an ideal society where everyone would be the same. For Napoleon, the revolution was not a dream. It was a stark reality. The old world was collapsing, and when the foundations crumble, every structure built upon them becomes fragile. In that moment, the important question was not who is right, but who is fast enough. Paris at this time resembled a vast machine that had suddenly lost its operator. Power shifted constantly, laws were written and erased, and beliefs were pushed from one extreme to another. Those who claimed to speak in the name of the people quickly learned that the people did not always know what they wanted, but they always knew what they feared, and that fear became fuel for violence. The guillotine did not merely sever heads, it severed what little sense of safety society still possessed. Napoleon observed all of this from a cold distance, not because he was indifferent, but because he understood something very early on. In chaos, emotion is a luxury. Those who allow themselves to be swept away by ideals are often crushed by the very wave they help create. The revolution, to him, was a vast vacuum of power, and a vacuum, by its nature, always calls for a hand firm enough to fill it. What set Napoleon apart was not loyalty to any faction, but his ability to adapt to the speed of the age. He was not deeply attached to the old regime, yet he did not deify the new order either. He saw what many were unwilling to admit. If a revolution lasts too long, it will consume itself. Ideals require stability in order to survive, and stability requires concentrated power. Yet very few at that time dared to speak such thoughts aloud. For a young officer like Napoleon, the revolution opened doors that in times of peace might have taken a lifetime to reach. The collapse of the old hierarchy meant that talent, or at least efficiency, had a chance to be noticed. Those once pushed to the margins, like himself, suddenly became valuable pieces, not because they were loved, but because they could get things done, quickly, precisely, without hesitation. But alongside opportunity came an even more important lesson. Power in revolutionary times is never stable. Today's hero can become tomorrow's traitor. Those who once stood at the highest podiums could fall so swiftly they scarcely had time to understand why. Napoleon watched leaders being swept away one by one, not because they were wrong, but because they were slow. Slow in decision-making, slow in understanding the fears of the masses, slow in accepting that order, however harsh, can sometimes be more bearable than prolonged chaos. Within this context, an idea began to take clear shape in Napoleon's mind. The revolution could not be a permanent state. It was only a transitional phase, and the ultimate victor would not be the one who shouted the loudest, but the one who knew how to end it at the right moment. To end it not with new promises, but with structure, not with emotion, but with discipline. From this perspective, the French Revolution did not create Napoleon. It gave him a stage, a chaotic and dangerous stage, yet one rich with opportunity for those who understood the mechanics of power. Napoleon learned to read the pulse of the crowd without letting his own heartbeat fall into rhythm with it. He learned to use the language of the revolution when necessary, without allowing it to dominate his thinking. In a world where everything was burning, he preserved within himself a necessary coldness so that he would not be consumed. And within that cold space, a way of life took shape. Never stand on one side for too long, never believe in any order so blindly, and always be ready to step forward while others were still arguing. Napoleon did not see himself as a product of the revolution. He saw the revolution as a temporary historical phase, a storm that had to pass so that the sky could be rearranged. When we look back now with the distance of time, it is easy to judge, to say that he betrayed ideals, that he exploited chaos. But perhaps the more meaningful question is the one posed by that era itself. If a society destroys all its old pillars before a new order is ready, who will step forward to keep it from collapsing entirely? And does that person need to believe in ideals or merely believe in efficiency? At this stage, the French Revolution was like a door ripped from its hinges. It opened space for freedom, but also for violence, for ambition, for those willing to step into the void that others feared. Napoleon was one of the very few such individuals, and he was waiting for the first moment to prove that he did not merely understand the revolution, but knew how to use it. That moment would not arrive in meeting halls or political forums, but on the battlefield. In the next part, at Toulon, the first gunshots of fate will ring out, not only marking the beginning of Napoleon's career, but also revealing a cold truth. In an age of chaos, efficiency always speaks louder than any ideal. There are moments when history needs no introduction. It arrives through sound. A gunshot, a command spoken at precisely the right moment, a cold decision that cuts through hesitation. Toulon, in the winter of 1793, was such a moment, not because of the scale of the battle, but because it was the first time Napoleon Bonaparte stepped out of the shadows of years spent observing and placed his hands directly on the very thing he had quietly learned to understand throughout his youth: power in action. At that time, Toulon was an open wound in revolutionary France, a strategic port city where the French fleet had fallen into the hands of royalist forces and foreign European powers lurking beyond. For the young revolutionary government, Toulon was not merely a military position, it was a symbol. To lose Toulon was to admit that the revolution could not defend itself, and in that moment of panic, those in charge began searching not for ideals, but for solutions. Napoleon arrived in Toulon not as a long-awaited hero. He was a young artillery officer, little known, without powerful political backing. But he possessed something extremely rare at that moment: clarity. While other commanders argued over plans, honor, and what was considered proper, Napoleon focused directly on the terrain, the artillery positions, and the supply lines. He did not ask, "How should we fight so that it looks noble?" He asked, "What must we do to win?" At Toulon, Napoleon proposed a solution that was brutally simple: seize the key high ground, position artillery so it could dominate the harbor, and force the enemy to withdraw. There were no glorious charges, no romantic visions of war, only calculation, only relentless pressure, and when the plan was carried out, it worked almost flawlessly. The victory at Toulon was more than a military success. It was a lesson etched deeply into Napoleon's thinking, and later, into the history of Europe itself. Efficiency is always rewarded, regardless of who produces it. In a society torn by chaos, where old values had been shattered and new ones had yet to take shape, results became the only language every faction could understand. After Toulon, Napoleon was no longer an anonymous officer. He was promoted rapidly, noticed, spoken of by name. But more important still, he learned how power operates in practice. Not the power of words, but the power of solving problems. The revolutionary government might not love him, might not fully trust him, but they needed him. And in politics, being needed can be more powerful than being loved. Toulon also marked a subtle transformation within Napoleon himself. If power had previously been a private dream, it now began to take concrete form. He realized that in this era, loyalty was flexible. Those who praised the revolution today could turn away tomorrow, and the reverse was equally true. But victory did not change. It stood there, requiring no explanation, no justification. And the one who created victory would always have a place, however temporary, within the new order. One aspect of Toulon is often overlooked, the way Napoleon viewed people. He did not see them primarily as individuals with complex emotions, but as elements within a system. This may sound cold, but it closely reflected the path he had walked since childhood. A child who belongs nowhere learns to reduce risk by not relying too heavily on emotion. At Toulon, Napoleon applied that same logic. Soldiers were forces to be used efficiently. Commanders were links to be replaced if they failed to function, and the objective was the only thing that could not be allowed to remain ambiguous. The victory at Toulon, therefore, did not merely save the revolutionary government in the short term. It planted a dangerous seed for the long term, the belief that violence, when used correctly, could be a legitimate political instrument. Napoleon did not invent this idea, but he learned it very quickly and very thoroughly. From that moment on, the relationship between Napoleon and the revolution became clearer than ever. He was not its loyal child, he was its user. The revolution gave him an opportunity. He gave the revolution survival, a cold exchange, devoid of emotion, yet extraordinarily effective. When night fell over Toulon after the victory, the gunfire had ceased, but something else had been awakened, an awareness that, in a world collapsing around itself, those who act decisively will always move faster than those still debating morality. From that moment, Napoleon was no longer merely an observer of history. He had become an agent of it. And this is also what makes this story especially aligned with the spirit of deep sleep of power. For in the quiet that follows violence, we see clearly a recurring rule of humanity. Power rarely begins with greatness. It often begins with a single decision made at the right moment, while others are still hesitating. In the next part, the lesson of Toulon will be pushed further, more boldly. In Paris, on the 13th of Vendemiaire, Napoleon will not use artillery merely to win a battle, but to suppress an entire crowd. And from that moment, he will draw an even colder truth. Power does not need to be loved. It only needs to be feared. There are days in history no longer than a single afternoon, yet their aftershocks last for centuries. The 13th of Vendemiaire, in the calendar of the French Revolution, was such a day, not because of the number of deaths, nor because of the grandeur of battle, but because, for the first time, a cold truth was spoken through action. Modern power does not need to persuade the crowd. It only needs to make the crowd stop. Paris in 1795 was a city exhausted. The revolution had gone on too long, too fast, and too brutally. People no longer lived on hope. They lived on fear, fear of hunger, fear of revenge, fear that tomorrow would not resemble today. The revolutionary government, now embodied in the Directory, was fragile, like a house hastily built after a storm. And before that house, an enraged crowd was advancing, carrying the memory of the old monarchy, the bitterness of the present, and the illusion that sheer numbers could once again decide the fate of the nation. In that moment, Napoleon Bonaparte was summoned not as a thinker, but as a technician of violence. No one asked him to persuade the crowd. No one expected him to reconcile. What was needed was someone willing to do what everyone else feared, to order fire upon the people of Paris. Napoleon did not hesitate. He positioned artillery at key points around the church of Saint-Roch. When the crowd advanced, he ordered the guns loaded with grape shot to fire, a weapon designed not to target individuals, but masses. Within minutes, the square transformed from a sea of people into an empty space, heavy with the smell of gunpowder and silence. The uprising ended so quickly that history itself seemed stunned. The most frightening aspect of the 13th of Vendemiaire was not the violence, but the efficiency. There were no prolonged negotiations, no governmental hesitation, only a decision carried out decisively, and a city forced to accept a new order. Napoleon did not merely save the Directory. He changed the way power would henceforth speak to modern urban society. From that moment, a harsh lesson was carved into history. Power does not need to be loved in order to endure. It only needs to be believed that it will not hesitate to use violence when necessary. The crowd, once the very soul of the revolution, understood for the first time that it was no longer the protagonist. It had become a variable to be controlled. For Napoleon, the 13th of Vendemiaire was not an emotional victory. It was a psychological test, and he passed it. He proved that he was not swayed by appearances, by immediate moral judgments, or by the fear of being condemned. In a world where everyone feared becoming the next to mount the scaffold, Napoleon demonstrated that he was willing to do what power demanded, even at the cost of hatred. For this reason, from the perspective of deep sleep of power, this is the moment when Napoleon truly crossed an invisible line. After Toulon, he was known as a man of ability. After the 13th of Vendemiaire, he was remembered as a man capable of enforcing order through violence. And between these two qualities, history often chooses the latter. The Directory may not have fully trusted Napoleon, but it learned something dangerous. He was a solution. In a society weary of debate, the one who brings silence, even through gunfire, is often seen as a savior. Napoleon became a symbol of stability in an unstable age, not because he promised a brighter future, but because he brought an end to the chaos of the present. From this point on, the relationship between Napoleon and the people grew more complex than ever. He was no longer a man of the crowd, but he did not need to be. He understood that modern power rests not on personal affection, but on a collective sense of security. People might hate him, but they slept more soundly knowing that Paris would not burn the next day. Perhaps in the silence that followed the grape shot, Napoleon saw his path with clarity. Not the path of a revolutionary, not the path of a philosopher, but the path of an administrator of order, is one willing to do what must be done so that society can continue to function. In retrospect, the 13th of Vendemiaire was not merely a bloody day. It was a hinge of modern French history, where power shifted from words to action, from ideals to control, and Napoleon once again stood in exactly the right place at that moment of transition. In the next part, as France grows accustomed to its new silence, Napoleon will begin to be seen not merely as a suppressor of unrest, but as a symbol of order. His victories in Italy will carry him from a keeper of domestic stability to the new hope of a republic exhausted by itself. After the 13th of Vendemiaire, Paris fell silent in a very different way. It was not the silence of consensus, but the silence of exhaustion. The Republic, after years of living in a permanent state of emergency, finally exhaled, not because it had discovered a new ideal, but because it had temporarily avoided collapse. In that pause, French society began to long for something simple, someone who could make things function again. No promises of paradise, just results. Napoleon Bonaparte appeared at precisely the right moment for that need, not as a politician armed with polished speeches, but as a man carrying achievements. To the Directory, he was an instrument of stability. To the public, he was the name associated with the fragile calm that had just been restored. And to Napoleon himself, this marked a crucial transition, from the man who put out fires at home to the man who would create victories abroad. The Italian campaign opened in that context, not merely as a military expedition, but as a political gamble. The French army at the time was poorly supplied, worn down, and low in morale. More experienced generals showed little enthusiasm for such a difficult front. But Napoleon saw a stage. In Italy, far from Paris, he could act faster, more boldly, and most importantly, tell the story of victory in his own way. Napoleon did not merely fight battles, he staged victories. He moved swiftly, struck at weaknesses, divided his enemies and forced them to react according to his tempo. But alongside artillery and formations, he wielded another weapon: words. The dispatches sent back to Paris were written with the rhythm of a legend in the making. Victories were portrayed as inevitable. Defeats, if they occurred, were softened within a larger narrative of relentless progress. In a republic exhausted by internal disputes, distant victories became a psychological remedy. They did not require citizens to think about morality, political systems, or an uncertain future. They asked him only for pride, and Napoleon understood this perfectly. He gave France what it needed at that moment, the feeling that it was still strong, still respected, still capable of winning. Here, the figure of the hero began to take shape, not from belief, but from relief. When society is tired, heroes do not need to be perfect. They only need to lighten the burden. Napoleon became the one who carried the worries of an entire nation. He took the war far away, allowing the homeland to momentarily forget its chaos. He brought victories back, covering political fractures with shared pride. Yet within this glow, a subtle misalignment began to appear. The Republic needed Napoleon as a general, but Napoleon began to see himself as something more comprehensive, a solution in full. He did not merely win for France. He organized conquered territories, arranged administrations, and intervened in local politics. In Italy, he behaved like a mobile state, where military orders blended seamlessly with civil decisions. This was no longer the role of a purely military commander. For those watching closely, an uncomfortable question emerged: who was controlling whom? The Republic granted Napoleon authority in order to win, but each victory granted him additional prestige, a form of power not written into any constitution, yet very real in the public imagination. When Napoleon's name was spoken more often than those of the politicians in Paris, the balance had already begun to tilt. Psychologically, this was the period in which Napoleon perfected a decisive skill, transforming personal success into collective necessity. He did not demand power outright. He allowed society to develop a habit of relying on him, and once such a habit is formed, it is exceedingly difficult to abandon. A weary republic is unlikely to challenge the man who provides it with a sense of safety and pride. In the slow cadence of Deep Sleep of Power, Part 7 is not the climax of war. but the climax of acceptance. Acceptance that power may be entrusted to a single individual, so long as that individual gets results. Acceptance that external order can compensate for internal instability, and acceptance that, at times, society chooses its heroes not for morality, but for relief. But it is precisely at this point that the story begins to drift away from safe ground. When an individual becomes a symbol of stability, he soon desires more than symbolism, and when a republic grows accustomed to delegating its trust, it becomes slow to recognize the moment when it must reclaim it. In the next part, as Napoleon turns his gaze beyond continental Europe, toward the east, toward Egypt, toward ancient myths, his ambition will no longer stop at military victory. It will shift to another level entirely, the construction of an image, the authorship of his own story, and the preparation for a role greater than that of a hero of a republic too exhausted to continue telling its own story. There is a very particular kind of loneliness, not the loneliness of having no one around, but the loneliness of standing among others while feeling as though you are separated from them by a thin pane of glass. You see them smile, hear them speak, sense the invisible rules that govern their interactions, yet you cannot touch them. For Napoleon, the early years he spent on mainland France, especially within the military education system, were precisely such a period. And if Part 2 was the story of a child born on the margins of France, then Part 3 is the story of a child who was repeatedly reminded that the margins were not merely a place, but a position in the minds of others. When Napoleon entered France's military schools, he stepped into a world that was both cold and sharply defined, where everything was measured by hierarchy, lineage, accent, posture, and even the manner of silence. Here, contempt did not need to be spoken aloud. It existed as an unwritten law. A Corsican boy, speaking French with a heavy accent, bearing a surname that sounded foreign, dressed more plainly, possessing less money and less refinement, automatically became the object of distance. What is striking is not that Napoleon was bullied or openly humiliated. In many cases, the harshest cruelty came in very small forms, whispers as he passed by, groups of classmates instinctively closing their circles when he approached, conversations that were warm a moment earlier turning cold when he spoke. It was precisely this kind of quiet exclusion that left no clear target for resistance, yet could never be forgotten. It created a lasting sensation. I do not belong here. And then, as a survival reflex, Napoleon learned an essential skill: silence. But this was not the silence of surrender. It was the silence of observation. When one is not invited into the world of others, one is forced to watch it from a distance. And from that distance, certain truths become clearer. You see who is listened to, even when they speak little. You see who can smile without fear of judgment. You see who is allowed to be wrong without being punished. During those years, Napoleon not only studied mathematics, maps, and artillery. He learned the social language of power, something not found in textbooks, yet decisive for the fate of every life. Precisely because he belonged to no group, Napoleon built a private world of his own, a world of imagination and will. Lonely children are often thought to be weak, but sometimes loneliness creates a dangerous capacity, the capacity to live without approval. When there is no one to please, one begins to please a different audience, one's future self. Deep within, Napoleon seems to have nurtured a future version of himself as a promise. The present boy might be mocked, excluded, or seen as an outsider, but the present boy could endure because he believed the future boy would repay everything. Within the military, to the east, was carefully cultivated. Here, he was no longer merely the commander of an army. He was the director of his own image. This revealed a new level of power that Napoleon was beginning to wield, the power of narrative. If Toulon and the 13th of Vendemiaire had taught him that violence could create order, Egypt taught him that image could sustain power even when reality turned unfavorable. In the emerging modern world, where information began to travel faster than armies, whoever controlled the story controlled collective memory. It was precisely here that the relationship between Napoleon and France began to change in subtle ways. While he was far away, France once again slipped into instability. The Directory remained weak, plagued by internal conflict and steadily losing credibility. Meanwhile, the image of Napoleon, despite the thousands of miles between them, grew ever larger in the public imagination. His absence, paradoxically, made him seem more necessary. When order falters, societies often remember those who once made them feel secure. At a deeper psychological level, Egypt was where Napoleon tested a dangerous idea, that he could exist independently of institutions, not in Paris, not within constitutional frameworks, only victory, image, and the belief that he was the man of the age. This was mental preparation for a far greater role, not as a tool of the Republic, but as the answer to its impotence. Yet ambition beyond France also exposed its limits. The desert was indifferent to myth. Distance showed no mercy to propaganda. And at some point, Napoleon understood that if he wished to seize the fate of France, he would have to return, not as a general coming back from a campaign, but as a solution for a nation that had lost its direction. And so, in strategic silence, Napoleon left Egypt. That decision, seen by many as an abandonment of his army, revealed a razor-sharp instinct for power instead. He knew when to withdraw from a story that was slipping beyond control in order to step into a more important one. Not the story of the East, but the story of France. In the next part, when Napoleon sets foot back in Paris, he will no longer appear as a mere general. He will emerge as a solution to a republic, exhausted by its own contradictions. And there, in the coup of 18 Brumaire, personal ambition will officially enter the center of power, no longer through the battlefield, but through politics. There are questions that do not arrive like a flash of lightning, but like a very soft knock, repeated again and again in the mind, until one can no longer ignore it. For Adam Smith, that question formed early, yet only became fully distinct after years of observing life and confronting inherited knowledge. Why does society continue to function even when no one controls it in its entirety? Not in moments of crisis, but in the most ordinary days, the question remained, quiet, persistent, refusing to leave. He had seen order arise in a small town where people simply did their own work and the whole community still endured. He had felt society's support during the most fragile moments of life. And he had also witnessed knowledge grow rigid when detached from lived experience. All of these experiences gradually converged on a single point. Social order cannot be explained by power or command alone. If that were the case, why did people still find ways to coordinate with one another in places where no guiding hand was clearly present? This question was neither confrontational nor rebellious. It carried the shape of deep curiosity. Adam Smith did not seek to prove that society is always good. He wanted only to understand why, among countless possibilities for disorders, human beings so often choose cooperation. What makes a person follow unwritten rules? What leads them to restrain themselves even when exploitation is possible? And what keeps these fragile relationships from completely falling apart? As he reflected on these matters, Adam Smith gradually realized that one cannot begin with systems. Systems are merely outcomes. To understand order, one must return to human beings, not idealized humans, but people as they truly are, both self-interested and capable of sympathy, calculating, yet yearning for respect. The question that would not release him was not, how do we control society? But what is it in human nature that allows society to hold itself together? At its deepest level, this was a moral question, not an economic one. It touched the hidden motivations that guide behavior, the desire to be seen by others, the fear of isolation, the sense of shame when doing wrong, and the quiet satisfaction of acting in accordance with shared expectations. Adam Smith began to see that these forces were more powerful than any law. They require no overseer because they already live within each individual. That question also led him to reconsider the notion of self-interest in a different light. Interest does not exist in a vacuum. A person may pursue what benefits them, but they must still take into account the reactions of others. If their actions shatter shared trust, those benefits will quickly disappear. And so, even without coercion, people learn to adjust their behavior, not because they are always virtuous, but because they live together. It was here that Adam Smith began to clearly sense the difference between coercion and mission, a statement that sounded reasonable, comforting, and easy to accept. But behind it lay a cold truth. From this point on, power would no longer belong to ideals, but to the one who managed those ideals. What makes 18 Brumaire remarkable is not bloodshed, but silent consent. The army supported it. Politicians yielded. The public exhaled in relief. No one truly resisted, because everyone feared that without Napoleon, everything would collapse once more. And in that fear, power was handed over more easily than in any revolution. From this moment onward, Napoleon was no longer a product of circumstance. He became the center of circumstance. He did not need to break the system. The system adjusted itself to revolve around him. This is the most durable form of power because it is not perceived as coercion, but as salvation. In the slow cadence of deep sleep of power, Part 9 is the moment when listeners may recognize a familiar rule of history. When societies are exhausted, they will accept anyone who offers a sense of control, and that person, if sufficiently intelligent, will not need to speak of power at all. He needs only to speak of order. But it is precisely here that the story enters its most dangerous territory. For when a general becomes the solution, the next question is unavoidable. How long will that solution last? And who will control the one who bears the title of solution? In the next part, as Napoleon assumes the role of first consul, we will see power begin to wear the mask of stability. Constitutions, plebiscites, and a new order will appear, not to restrain him, but to legitimize his increasingly irreplaceable presence in the fate of France. There is a form of power that enters history not with shouting, but with a sigh of relief. It does not smash down old doors, but gently closes those that have been rattling violently in the wind. When Napoleon Bonaparte became first consul of France, power did not appear as a seizure. It appeared as a very simple promise. From now on, things would be stable. After the 18 Brumaire, France no longer had the strength for another political experiment. The people were exhausted by constantly changing constitutions, short-lived governments, and endless calls for sacrifice. In that context, the title First Consul sounded remarkably reasonable. Not a king, not a dictator, just an administrator, a mediator, someone tasked with keeping the wheel of history turning without snapping its axle. Napoleon understood the power of form extremely well. He did not rush to dismantle the language of the Republic. On the contrary, he used it skillfully. A new constitution was promulgated. Plebiscites were organized. Concepts such as the people, stability, and national interest were repeated with great frequency. Everything appeared legal, rational, and above all, reassuring. Power, in Napoleon's hands, did not confront liberty directly. It wore the mask of protecting liberty from chaos. Yet behind that mask, a truth slowly emerged. Power was concentrating, very slowly, very evenly, and almost without noise. Legislative bodies were weakened in the name of efficiency. The press was guided so as not to cause instability. Political opponents were not executed en masse as during the Terror, but were blurred, pushed to the margins, and cut off from the flow of influence. Compared to the open violence of the Revolution, this method was far gentler, and for that very reason, it was more dangerous. Napoleon did not rule through direct fear. He ruled through comparison. Compared to the recent years of chaos, his order looked like a gift. People were not asked what they had lost. They were only reminded of what they had escaped. And in human psychology, relief is often more readily accepted than abstract freedom. As first consul, Napoleon began to reveal clearly the nature of a modern manager of power. He did not seek to control every thought, but to control the structures that rendered those thoughts harmless. Laws were standardized. The administrative apparatus was reorganized. Education, finance, and the military, all were arranged according to the logic of order and efficiency. France gradually became a machine that functioned more smoothly than ever before. And within that machine, Napoleon was the central coordinator. What makes this phase especially aligned with the spirit of deep sleep of power is that power at this point was no longer noisy. It was steady, rhythmic, like breathing after a long fever has finally broken. People grew accustomed to waking up without fearing that there would be a new government, new laws, or a new purge. And when people become accustomed to calm, they rarely question the price paid for it. Napoleon, once an outsider to society, had now become the one who shaped it. Yet notably, he maintained the image of someone who simply worked. He appeared as a senior civil servant of history, diligent, disciplined, restrained in emotion. That image helped him avoid early resistance. People did not see a tyrant. They saw a strict but necessary administrator. However, beneath that surface of stability, a profound shift was taking place in how France understood power. Power was no longer seen as a danger that needed to be restrained, but as a tool that needed to be operated efficiently. And when efficiency becomes the highest measure, questions of moral limits are gradually pushed aside. Napoleon did not need to declare himself indispensable. Society reached that conclusion on its own as everything began to depend on him. Here, we may pause briefly to assess. Napoleon, as first consul, did not betray the revolution in a crude way. He completed it in a cold one. The revolution destroyed the old order. Napoleon built a new one. And in the process of construction, personal power gradually became a necessary condition for society to continue functioning. But history rarely stops at what is merely sufficient. Once power has been concentrated, the question is no longer, should stability be maintained? But, to whom does this stability belong? And when one person has grown accustomed to coordinating an entire nation, sharing power begins to feel unnecessary. In the next part, with the emergence of the Napoleonic Code, we will witness a subtle yet decisive shift. Power will not only be exercised, but written into law. It will no longer exist solely within Napoleon himself, but will be embedded deeply into the structure of the modern state, more durable than any battle and longer lasting than any political title. There are forms of power that survive by the sound of gunfire, and there are forms of power that endure through words. Gunfire erupts and then fades. Words, if written correctly, can remain for centuries. Napoleon Bonaparte understood this earlier than many of his contemporaries. After securing order through action, he began to seek another form of power, quieter, deeper, and far more enduring, the power of law. France entered the 19th century burdened with a chaotic legal inheritance. Old feudal laws overlapped with improvised revolutionary decrees, while local customs contradicted one another. The same act could be legal in one region and criminal in another. The revolution had destroyed privilege, but it had not yet created a unified legal order to replace it. And within that vacuum, Napoleon saw an opportunity no battlefield could offer: the standardization of society through law. The Napoleonic Code was not written as a declaration of ideals. It was constructed as an operating tool, clear, concise, applicable. All citizens were equal before the law, at least on paper. Property rights were protected, contracts were upheld. The family was defined as a unit of order, with the man placed at its center of authority. It was not a perfect world, but it was a predictable one. And in history, predictability is sometimes more valuable than abstract justice. Napoleon did not write this code to be loved. He wrote it to be repeated. Here, his power no longer depended on personal presence, no longer required armies or victories. It was packaged into a system, copied, implemented, taught. A man can be overthrown. A legal code, once woven into the fabric of daily life, is far more difficult to erase. What invites reflection is this: the Napoleonic Code carried the spirit of the revolution, but in an entirely different form. It preserved the idea of legal equality, while stripping away the emotional chaos of revolutionary fervor. It did not encourage uprising. It encouraged compliance, not obedience to Napoleon as a person, but obedience to an order designed by him. And it was precisely this separation that made the code powerful. People did not need to love Napoleon in order to live within Napoleon's world. From the perspective of deep sleep of power, this is the moment when power reaches its quietest state. No speeches are required. No symbols are needed. Only articles of law applied steadily day after day. When law functions smoothly, power becomes invisible, and therefore less likely to be resisted. People grow accustomed to following rules and gradually forget to ask, who wrote these rules and why? The Napoleonic Code also reveals a defining trait of Napoleon's thinking: his faith in structure over people. That belief was shaped by his entire life. From a child who belonged nowhere, to a general who distrusted crowds, to a first consul who understood that personal loyalty is always fragile. Structures are different. Structures have no emotions. They do not betray. They do not grow tired. Yet this very coldness also imposed limits. The Napoleonic Code prioritized order over individual freedom, especially for women and within the family. It reflected a society that needed stability more than liberation, but perhaps that is precisely why it endured. History shows that systems which are progressive enough to replace the old, yet conservative enough not to frighten society, are often the ones that survive. When Napoleon carried this code with him on his campaigns, he did not bring only armies. He brought a model of the state. In many parts of Europe, the Napoleonic code remained in force even after French troops withdrew. This reveals a rare truth in the history of power. People may despise the conqueror, yet still keep the tools the conqueror leaves behind, if those tools make life more intelligible. Here we can offer a fair assessment. Even if Napoleon had never won another battle after this point, he would still rank among the most influential figures in European history, for he achieved what very few conquerors ever manage. He transformed personal power into impersonal structure. He turned his own will into a social habit. But within that success, a paradox began to form. When order had been written into law, when the state operated like a machine, the role of the man at the top became both indispensable and overwhelmingly significant. Napoleon began to be not only the builder of the system, but the symbol of the system itself. And when symbol and power fuse, ambition rarely stops at administration. In the next part, when Napoleon places the crown upon his own head, we will witness the moment when law, order, and personal power converge. The revolution will officially don a crown, and France will enter a new era, one in which power no longer hides behind the mask of stability, but openly assumes the form of an emperor. There are moments in history when symbols speak more loudly than any speech. The day Napoleon Bonaparte placed the crown upon his own head at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris in 1804 was such a moment, not because of the splendor of the ceremony, but because of the heavy silence that enveloped it. In that instant, the French Revolution, once sworn to abolish monarchy, was not betrayed by violence, but by legalization. It placed the crown upon its own head and stepped into a new form. Napoleon did not kneel before the Pope. He did not receive power from God. He placed the crown upon his own head, a cold declaration that his authority came neither from heaven nor from bloodline. It came from the history just lived through, from the order he had built, and from the weary acceptance of a nation long exhausted by instability. This was not a return to the old feudal monarchy. It was a new kind of monarchy, a monarchy born of a tamed revolution. For many contemporaries, Napoleon's self-coronation was shocking. Yet if we slow down and look more closely, it appears almost inevitable. After years of chaos, France had grown accustomed to a single individual standing at the center of every decision. The state functioned smoothly because of Napoleon. The law was stable because of Napoleon. The army won because of Napoleon. When everything already revolved around one person, attaching an official title to that person became only a matter of time. Napoleon understood that power requires not only effectiveness, but ritual. Human beings cannot live forever by dry rules alone. They need images, symbols, something to believe that this order is right, legitimate, and lasting. The crown, in this case, was not a retreat into the past. It was Napoleon's way of packaging the new order in a familiar and acceptable form. The revolution might despise kings, but society always needs a symbolic center. From the perspective of deep sleep of power, this is the moment when power reaches its most dangerously quiet state. There are no longer fiery slogans, no more debates about the future. There remains only an unspoken truth. France needs Napoleon, and Napoleon has become France. When an individual and a nation begin to merge in the collective imagination, power no longer needs to justify itself. Notably, Napoleon did not erase the legacy of the revolution entirely. He preserved many of its achievements: legal equality, advancement based on merit, and the abolition of old aristocratic privilege. But he reordered priorities. Freedom no longer came first. Stability did. And to protect that stability, concentrated power became reasonable. The revolution, once an open-ended process, was now closed with a crown. In Napoleon's own psychology, becoming emperor was not a betrayal of himself. It was a completion. He had come full circle. From a Corsican child who belonged nowhere to a man who placed himself above all former identities. The crown did not give him an origin. It gave him an ending to his sense of inferiority. He no longer needed to be accepted. He became the standard to which others had to adapt. Yet here, a subtle shift occurred in Napoleon's relationship with power. As first consul, he ruled through effectiveness. As emperor, he began to rule through grandeur. Rituals, court life, and imperial symbols gradually emerged. Power was no longer only a means of running society, but a means of asserting itself in history. And when power begins to gaze into the mirror, it often forgets its limits. By crowning himself, Napoleon also sent a clear message to Europe. The French Revolution was no longer an unstable phenomenon to be suppressed, but a new empire to be treated as an equal. Napoleon did not want France merely to be a victorious nation. He wanted it to become the center of a new European order, and he was the embodiment of that order. Yet within this majesty, the seeds of tragedy were already being sown. Once power becomes personalized to this degree, every challenge to the system becomes a challenge to the individual himself. Every failure is no longer a failure of policy, but a failure of the emperor. And when an empire is built upon the capacities of a single person, it remains stable only so long as that person appears invincible. Looking back, the moment Napoleon crowned himself was not merely a political event. It was a profound historical lesson. Revolutions may overthrow kings, but they cannot erase the human need for a center of power. And when that center is not constrained by principle, it will eventually place a crown upon its own head, whatever name it chooses to give it. In the next part, as Napoleon's empire begins to expand across Europe, that power will no longer be tested through ceremony, but on the battlefield. War will become a method of governance, and each new victory, rather than consolidating order, will summon new enemies, signaling that the crown just placed upon Napoleon's head is also an invitation to an endless chain of conflict. There are empires that expand in order to defend themselves, and there are empires that expand because they no longer know how to stop. When Napoleon placed the crown upon his head, war did not end. It changed its role. From that point on, war was no longer a means of securing France's position, but a method for governing all of Europe. The map was no longer a static backdrop for history to unfold. It became something constantly rewritten by marching armies, treaties, and dense red arrows. In Napoleon's logic, victory was the only way to sustain the new order. A newly born empire needed a recognition, and in the world of European dynasties, recognition rarely came from goodwill. It came from fear. Each campaign, each battle, was not merely intended to defeat the immediate enemy, but to send a message. The old order had ended, and the new order had an owner. Europe thus became a chain reaction. Alliances formed, dissolved, and formed again. States that had once opposed one another over their own interests now set aside rivalries to confront a center of power growing too rapidly. And within this vortex, Napoleon always seemed to be one step ahead. He moved quickly, struck decisively, and forced his opponents to react on his terms. War, in his hands, took on the rhythm of a perfectly lubricated machine. Yet what deserves attention is not only military genius, but the way Napoleon transformed war into governance. Conquered territories were reorganized, laws imposed, and loyal figures installed in positions of authority. Wherever the French army marched, Napoleon's model of the state followed. For many regions, this was a shock. For others, a form of opening. The new order might be imposed, but it also brought unity, predictability, and a degree of modernization that older regimes had postponed for too long. However, the cost of that unity was immense. When war becomes the normal condition, society itself is reshaped according to the logic of war. Taxation, conscription, and control of information all were justified by the needs of the empire. In Paris, power became even more centralized. In distant regions, resistance smoldered quietly. Europe was not merely a battlefield between armies. It was a battlefield between two visions of order, one grounded in traditional balance, the other in efficient imposition. In the slow cadence of deep sleep of power, this phase carries a strange dual feeling, both radiant and heavy. Radiant because victory followed victory, because genius seemed without limits. Heavy because each victory brought new obligations, new fronts, new enemies. The empire could not stand still, for standing still meant allowing alliances time to breathe. Napoleon, at the center of this machine, increasingly became a prisoner of his own success. When order is built on victory, peace becomes dangerous. Peace allows opponents to reorganize, allows discontent to accumulate, and allows questions of legitimacy to be raised. War, paradoxically, restores a sense of control, and so Europe continued to burn. Not because solutions were lacking, but because the only solution had become a habit. On a psychological level, this was the period when Napoleon's power began to take on an addictive quality. Not an addiction to violence, but an addiction to the rhythm of victory. Each pause increased the risk. Each advance postponed it. And within that logic of postponement, the scope of conflict had to expand. The empire no longer faced a simple choice between fighting or not fighting. It was trapped in a more difficult question: where to fight next. From the perspective of ordinary people, Europe became a prolonged landscape of insecurity. Treaties were signed and torn apart. Borders were drawn and erased. Personal lives were swept along by decisions made far away. Here the historical lesson becomes clear. When power is concentrated too heavily at a single center, every movement carries enormous force. Victories resound loudly. Defeats are catastrophic. And within that latent catastrophe, cracks began to appear. Not on the battlefields where Napoleon could dictate tempo, but in places where war became prolonged, draining and corrosive to the empire's legitimacy. There, victories were no longer swift, governance was no longer smooth, and order was no longer experienced as a gift. Looking back, Europe's transformation into a battlefield was not merely the result of personal ambition. It was the outcome of a model of power that believed stability must be maintained through constant pressure. That model can function in the short term, when speed and talent are overwhelming. But in the long term, it confronts an enemy no tactic can defeat: the exhaustion of people and societies. In the next part, as Napoleon becomes entangled in Spain, we will see what happens when war is no longer a series of decisive battles, but a drawn-out war of attrition, when the people, rather than regular armies, become the adversary, and when power, accustomed to command from above, is forced to confront a form of resistance that obeys none of the empire's rhythms. There are moments when history needs no introduction. It arrives through sound. A gunshot. A command spoken at precisely the right moment. A cold decision that cuts through hesitation. Toulon, in the winter of 1793, was such a moment, not because of the scale of the battle, but because it was the first time Napoleon Bonaparte stepped out of the shadows of years spent observing and placed his hands directly on the very thing he had quietly learned to understand throughout his youth: power in action. At that time, Toulon was an open wound in revolutionary France, a strategic port city where the French fleet had fallen into the hands of royalist forces and foreign European powers lurking beyond. For the young revolutionary government, Toulon was not merely a military position, it was a symbol. To lose Toulon was to admit that the revolution could not defend itself, and in that moment of panic, those in charge began searching not for ideals, but for solutions. Napoleon arrived in Toulon not as a long-awaited hero. He was a young artillery officer, little known, without powerful political backing. But he possessed something extremely rare at that moment: clarity. While other commanders argued over plans, honor, and what was considered proper, Napoleon focused directly on the terrain, the artillery positions, and the supply lines. He did not ask, "How should we fight so that it looks noble?" He asked, "What must we do to win?" At Toulon, Napoleon proposed a solution that was brutally simple: seize the key high ground, position artillery so it could dominate the harbor, and force the enemy to withdraw. There were no glorious charges, no romantic visions of war, only calculation, only relentless pressure, and when the plan was carried out, it worked almost flawlessly. The victory at Toulon was more than a military success. It was a lesson etched deeply into Napoleon's thinking, and later into the history of Europe itself. Efficiency is always rewarded, regardless of who produces it. In a society torn by chaos, where old values had been shattered and new ones had yet to take shape, results became the only language every faction could understand. After Toulon, Napoleon was no longer an anonymous officer. He was promoted rapidly, noticed, spoken of by name. But more important still, he learned how power operates in practice. Not the power of words, but the power of solving problems. The revolutionary government might not love him, might not fully trust him, but they needed him. And in politics, being needed can be more powerful than being loved. Toulon also marked a subtle transformation within Napoleon himself. If power had previously been a private dream, it now began to take concrete form. He realized that in this era, loyalty was flexible. Those who praised the revolution today could turn away tomorrow, and the reverse was equally true. But victory did not change. It stood there, requiring no explanation, no contradictions. Napoleon had believed that order could replace ideals, but in Spain, order was perceived as occupation, while ideals, however vague, became the driving force of resistance. The values carried by the empire were no longer seen as progress, but as imposition, and once power is felt to be foreign, it can never be fully accepted. From Spain onward, Napoleon's enemies began to learn an important lesson. They did not need to defeat him in a single decisive battle. They only needed to prevent him from ending the war, to prolong it, to drain him, to wait. Genius, when forced to operate without an endpoint, gradually loses its edge, and an empire, drawn into too many endless fronts, thins itself out. On Napoleon's side, the decision to remain mired in Spain revealed a dangerous shift in how he understood power. He no longer asked, "Is this necessary?" He asked only, "How do we maintain it?" When power moves from creating order to protecting its own image, It enters a phase of self-defense, and self-defense in history rarely leads to good outcomes. Seen from a distance, Spain was not Napoleon's greatest military defeat, but it was his first strategic defeat in the long term. It exposed the limits of strength, drained the army, and most importantly, eroded the belief that the empire was inevitable. Power, for the first time, began to be perceived as a burden, and within that erosion, a dangerous illusion persisted that a sufficiently great victory elsewhere could conceal all the cracks. Napoleon, accustomed to solving problems through bold action, began to turn his gaze eastward toward Russia, where he believed a decisive blow could reassert order, restore prestige, and end the chain of instability. In the next part, as Napoleon advances into the vast expanse of Russia, power will no longer confront a rebelling people, but the cold limits of nature and time. And there, ambition that does not know how to stop will, for the first time, collide with an adversary that cannot be subdued by will or violence, the indifferent immensity of the world itself. There are moments in history when power is neither seized nor handed over amid cheering crowds. Instead, it is invited in, invited as a last resort when every other path has faded. The coup of 18. Brumaire did not begin with gunfire, but with the collective exhaustion of a nation, and it was precisely in that state of fatigue that Napoleon Bonaparte entered the center of power, not as a rebel, but as a solution. By the end of 1799, France had lost faith in itself. The Directory still existed in name, but real power had decayed, fragmented, and riddled with suspicion. The promises of the revolution now rang hollow. People no longer asked, "Who is right?" They asked, "Who can get things done?" And after years of war and chaos, that question seemed to have only one familiar answer: Napoleon. What is striking is that Napoleon did not return to Paris in the posture of a challenger. He did not call upon the masses to rise up, nor did he incite street violence. On the contrary, he appeared calm, almost humble. He spoke of stability, of order, of saving the Republic from its own impotence. The language he used was not the language of ambition, but the language of responsibility, and that was precisely what made him dangerous. In closed meetings and corridors of power, Napoleon was mentioned not as a man who wanted to rule, but as a man who could help, a general with credibility in the army, a name trusted by the public, a figure strong enough to keep the machinery of the state from collapsing. When society is too weary to debate, solutions are often preferred over principles. The coup of 18. Brumaire therefore bore the appearance of an arrangement rather than a seizure of power. Politicians believed they could use Napoleon, that he was merely a temporary tool, a strong hand to clean up the chaos, who would then return to his place. But they forgot one lesson history repeats relentlessly. No one can control the person whom society itself needs. At the moment when power was transferred, Napoleon did not rush to present himself as the victor. He let others speak for him, sign for him, and argue for him. He observed, he waited, and when necessary, he appeared as the only one capable of ending the confusion. This was not the eruption of ambition, but the patience of someone who understood the rhythm of power. From a psychological perspective, this was the most important transition in Napoleon's journey. He no longer needed victory to prove his worth. He became the measure of stability itself. And when an individual becomes the measure, the institutions around him will gradually adjust to fit that individual. The revolution had sought to eliminate dependence on any single person, yet in its exhaustion, it returned to the oldest model of all, placing trust in a strong individual. Napoleon understood this perfectly. He did not declare the end of the revolution. He merely said that the revolution had fulfilled its bastion. The image of invincibility cracks. Every alliance begins to recalculate. Russia taught history a simple yet brutal lesson. There are spaces that cannot be conquered, only respected. Napoleon did not lose because he lacked talent, but because he applied a model of power unsuited to the scale of the world he sought to control. The empire, built upon constant expansion, collided with its own physical limits. Upon his return, Napoleon still held the throne, still bore the title, but the empire was no longer whole. The army was gravely diminished, prestige was damaged, and most importantly, his opponents had learned that he could be drawn into a war that could not be ended on his own terms. This was the moment when the balance of power in Europe began to shift irreversibly. In the slow cadence of the late night, the Russian campaign appears not as a loud catastrophe, but as a slipping away. Day by day, mile by mile, opportunity by opportunity lost. There was no single decision to blame, only the accumulation of time. And when time stands with the opponent, even the greatest power grows weary. From here on, the story is no longer that of an expanding empire, but of an empire trying to hold what remains. European nations, once hesitant, began to unite around a new belief. Genius was no longer exclusive. Alliances formed not in hope of swift victory, but in confidence that time now stood on their side. In the next part, as European coalitions gradually close the ring, we will see that collapse does not arrive in a single day. It comes step by step, battle by battle, concession by concession. And when power has been eroded by space and time, the remaining question is no longer who is stronger, but who can endure standing the longest. There are empires that collapse in a single morning, through a coup, a bullet, or a decree. But there are also empires that unravel more slowly, more quietly, like a body once strong, gradually losing its resistance. After Russia, Napoleon's power entered such a phase. There was no clear moment of ending, only a succession of days in which, with each passing day, the empire became harder to hold than the day before. Returning from the Russian campaign, Napoleon was still emperor, but he was no longer an irreplaceable center. The army had suffered devastating losses. Satellite states began to waver, and most importantly, the nations of Europe had learned how to coordinate with one another. New alliances formed not out of absolute confidence in victory, but out of a more practical realization. If they endured long enough, this empire would exhaust itself. What made this period distinctive was the gradual loss of exclusive advantage. Previously, Napoleon had often faced his opponents one by one. Now he confronted a system that learned quickly, shared experience, and adjusted tactics so as no longer to be drawn into his rhythm. Military genius was still there, but it no longer stood before fragmented adversaries. It faced a patient network. In each subsequent battle, victory was no longer decisive. Every success consumed more time, more men, more resources. Every defeat, however small, was amplified in Europe's political psychology. Prestige, the asset that had once compensated for every shortage, began to leak away. And once prestige leaks, power must spend more simply to maintain the same effect. At a deeper level, this was the phase in which power turned inward to protect itself. Many decisions were no longer made to expand order, but to preserve appearance. Many campaigns were launched, not because they were necessary, but because weakness could not be allowed to show. Power When it loses confidence in the future, tightens its grip on the present, and in doing so, becomes rigid. Napoleon continued to coordinate, to command, to reorganize. He never gave up, but time was no longer on his side. With each passing campaign season, manpower gaps could not be filled as before. Experienced generals gradually disappeared. New soldiers did not carry the same faith, the same memory of victory. The empire began to operate more by inertia than by inspiration. Collapse, at this stage, did not take the shape of a great tragedy. It appeared in very small details. A territory that no longer paid taxes on time, an ally slow to send troops, a city that no longer raised flags with former enthusiasm. Taken individually, these signals were easy to overlook. Taken together, they formed an undeniable picture. The center of power was weakening. Notably, Napoleon was not entirely blind to this shift. He saw the change. But he was bound by the very structure of power he had created. When everything depended on his person, admitting limits became dangerous. A single concession could be interpreted as a weakness. And in European politics at the time, weakness meant being torn apart. And so Napoleon continued to fight, not because he was certain of victory, but because not fighting would bring collapse more quickly. This was the final paradox of power. It compels its holder to prolong the game, even when he knows the game no longer favors him. And in that prolongation, power gradually loses its ability to choose. In the slow rhythm of the late night, this phase carries a distinct kind of sadness. Not the sorrow of immediate defeat, but the sorrow of attrition. What was once solid becomes fragile. Decisions that once produced victory now only suffice to delay. The empire, built upon constant forward motion, now learns to defend, and defense had never been its strength. At last, collapse did not arrive in a single day, but it became unavoidable. As alliances tightened their grip, as resources proved insufficient to sustain multiple fronts, as the image of invincibility faded into memory, power entered its final stage, not loudly, but decisively. In the next part, as the circle closes in, Napoleon will be forced to relinquish the throne for the first time. Not as an emperor defeated in a great battlefield clash, but as a giant diminished, pushed to the margins of history in exile on Elba. And it is there that the story of power will shift into a different rhythm, quieter, lonelier, yet not entirely concluded. There are failures that do not end in death, but in diminution, not total disappearance, but the moment when a person who once stood at the center of history is pushed to its margins. Napoleon's first exile on the island of Elba was such a moment. Quiet, bloodless, yet carrying the weight of a profound reversal. Power leaving the body, leaving behind a human being forced to learn how to live in silence. Elba was not a dungeon. It was a small island, close enough to Europe not to be forgotten, yet far enough to no longer matter. There, Napoleon was still called emperor, still had a guard, still observed ritual. But everything existed on a different scale. Maps that had once covered a continent now shrank within his sight. Orders that had once shaken dynasties now sufficed only to govern a few villages, a few roads, a few ports. Power, once detached from its familiar magnitude, suddenly revealed itself as a habit that had been lost. What made Elba distinctive was not the living conditions, but the psychological shift. For the first time in many years, Napoleon did not have to respond to alliances, calculate campaign tempos, or sustain the image of invincibility. Time, once the enemy in the Russian campaign, now became a void, and that void compelled a person to confront himself. Napoleon did not collapse on Elba. He continued to work, to organize, to improve infrastructure, to care about the lives of the inhabitants. It was the instinct of a man accustomed to running systems. But beneath that activity lay a quiet question. If power had once defined this man, then when power was reduced, what remained? Elba became a magnifying mirror, reflecting the dissonance between title and reality. Here history reveals a subtle paradox. The victor's leniency inadvertently kept the flame alive. Napoleon was not tightly imprisoned, not completely cut off from information. News from Europe continued to arrive. Dissatisfaction with the new order continued to murmur, and memories of an era of power, rather than being buried, were nourished within the steady rhythm of island life. From Europe's perspective, Elba was considered a safe solution. Napoleon was removed from the center of power, order was restored, and dynasties breathed easier. But that order was stitched together hastily. The victorious states were not united around a shared future, only around ending the past. And when the future remains undefined, the past finds it easy to return, especially when that past is still alive, still named, still remembered. In the slow cadence of deep sleep of power, Elba is not a chapter of rest. It is a chapter of accumulation. Day by day, Napoleon learned how to exist without victory, yet without accepting oblivion. He observed, weighed, and gradually realized that power does not reside solely in armies or territory, but also in symbols. And symbols, if not yet shattered in the human mind, can still find their way back. What invites reflection is how Napoleon viewed his own failure during this period. He did not see it as an inevitable end, but as a temporary misalignment of circumstances. That view may be dismissed as an illusion, yet history often shows that those who have once achieved the impossible rarely accept new limits as permanent. Elba thus became a place that nurtured a dangerous belief, that the present order was unstable, and that society would again turn to the one who had once provided a sense of control. At a deeper level, Elba allowed Napoleon to understand more clearly the nature of modern power. Removed from the center, he could see what had once bound people to him. Not enduring love, but the habit of reliance. And habits, once disrupted by new instability, seek to return to what is familiar. Elba did not give him a great army, but it gave him time to wait for the moment. That moment arrived not with gunfire, but with fractures in the post-Napoleonic order. The clumsy decisions of the restored monarchies, their distance from the old armies, and the nostalgia for a time of strong order began to spread. From Elba, Napoleon did not need to incite much. He merely needed to exist as a possibility, and it is here that the story of power enters its grayest zone. For if power once brought war and suffering, the memory of that power can bring a sense of security to the weary. History does not move only by lessons, it moves by emotion. Elba became the suspension point between the two, between the lesson of collapse and the emotion of nostalgia. When night fell on the small island, silence was no longer an ending. It was preparation. Napoleon, who had once controlled the tempo of all Europe, now controlled the tempo of waiting. And within that waiting, another chapter was taking shape. Brief, dramatic, and more symbolic than any campaign before it. In the next part, the silence of Elba will be broken, not by a massive invasion, but by the pull of a name. The 100 days will begin, where power returns not through violence, but through belief, habit, and memories not yet faded. There are moments in history that do not require force to begin. Only memory. Napoleon's return from Elba Inaugurating the 100 Days was such a moment. No cannons thundered at the borders. No ultimatums were issued. There was only a man stepping onto the shores of France, carrying a name that had once shaped an entire era, and that name alone was enough to shake the fragile order that had just been rebuilt. Napoleon returned not as an invader, but as a reminder that power once held still existed, in the memories of soldiers, in the habits of institutions, in the nostalgia of a society not yet reconciled with the present. The regiments sent to stop him did not fire. They recognized him before they recognized their orders, and in that moment of recognition, power did not need coercion. It was handed back. What makes the 100 Days distinctive is not its speed, but its silence. There was no initial violence, no public compulsion, only nods of assent, ranks opening on their own, old flags raised again as if they had never been lowered. A myth, when it still lives in the collective memory, can move faster than any army. Psychologically, this was the moment when power revealed its purest form, the power of the symbol. Napoleon did not need to prove he was right. He needed only to exist as an alternative, more familiar, more forceful than the newly imposed order, and in that comparison, a weary society chose what felt less unsettling, a return to what had once functioned. Yet the 100 Days was not a full revival. It carried the breathless rhythm of a final opportunity. Napoleon understood this clearly. He returned to Paris aware that time no longer stood on his side. He attempted to adjust, to soften, to promise a more tolerant, more constitutional empire. But these adjustments unfolded within too narrow a window before a Europe that had learned not to hesitate. Here, history presents a profound paradox. Power can return quickly, but legitimacy cannot. The European powers did not view the 100 Days as an internal political episode of France. They saw it as an existential threat, and unlike before, they did not wait for Napoleon to act first. The coalition was activated almost immediately, with a rare unanimity. This time, the story had to end. In the slow cadence of the late night, the 100 Days carries the mournful beauty of a legend that knows it is nearing its end. There is courage, but no longer illusion. There is loyalty, but tinged with anxiety. Napoleon, at the center of this vortex, is no longer the one who sets the tempo. He is racing against time, once his ally, now his adversary. What invites reflection is the way society responded during this period. Not everyone returned out of unwavering belief. Many returned because of memory, because of habit, because of fear of a new order that had not yet taken root. The 100 Days shows that power rests not only on active support, but also on the reluctance of those who no longer see a better choice. And that reluctance, though sufficient to bring a legend back, is not enough to keep it standing for long. In this return, Napoleon did not immediately commit great strategic errors, but he lacked the most crucial element, time to err and to correct. Every decision was scrutinized, every move was encircled. A legend, once returned, no longer has room to grow. It can only conclude. Seen from a distance, the 100 Days resembles the final moment of a familiar piece of music, when the melody is played once more, faster, more compressed, before falling silent. It does not deny what came before. It confirms that what came before was once very real. But it also reveals that the age has changed, and that power cannot live forever on memory. In the next part, the moment of ending will no longer arrive in silence. It will come on a field at Waterloo, where history will no longer allow the legend to continue. There, the space for symbols will close. giving way to the cold reality of final defeat. There is a form of power that enters history not with shouting, but with a sigh of relief. It does not smash down old doors, but gently closes those that have been rattling violently in the wind. When Napoleon Bonaparte became first consul of France, power did not appear as a seizure. It appeared as a very simple promise. From now on, things would be stable. After the 18 Brumaire, France no longer had the strength for another political experiment. The people were exhausted by constantly changing constitutions, short-lived governments, and endless calls for sacrifice. In that context, the title First Consul sounded remarkably reasonable. Not a king, not a dictator, just an administrator, a mediator, someone tasked with keeping the wheel of history turning without snapping its axle. Napoleon understood the power of form extremely well. He did not rush to dismantle the language of the Republic. On the contrary, he used it skillfully. A new constitution was promulgated. Plebiscites were organized. Concepts such as the people, stability, and national interest were repeated with great frequency. Everything appeared legal, rational, and above all, reassuring. Power, in Napoleon's hands, did not confront liberty directly. It wore the mask of protecting liberty from chaos. Yet behind that mask, a truth slowly emerged. Power was concentrating, very slowly, very evenly, and almost without noise. Legislative bodies were weakened in the name of efficiency. The press was guided so as not to cause instability. Political opponents were not executed en masse as during the Terror, but were blurred, pushed to the margins, and cut off from the flow of influence. Compared to the open violence of the Revolution, this method was far gentler, and for that very reason, it was more dangerous. Napoleon did not rule through direct fear. He ruled through comparison. Compared to the recent years of chaos, his order looked like a gift. People were not asked what they had lost. They were only reminded of what they had escaped. And in human psychology, relief is often more readily accepted than abstract freedom. As first consul, Napoleon began to reveal clearly the nature of a modern manager of power. He did not seek to control every thought, but to control the structures that rendered those thoughts harmless. Laws were standardized. The administrative apparatus was reorganized. Education, finance, and the military, all were arranged according to the logic of order and efficiency. France gradually became a machine that functioned more smoothly than ever before. And within that machine, Napoleon was the central coordinator. What makes this phase especially aligned with the spirit of deep sleep of power is that power at this point was no longer noisy. It was steady, rhythmic, like breathing after a long fever has finally broken. People grew accustomed to waking up without fearing that there would be a new government, new laws, or a new purge. And appears not as a violent tragedy, but as a profound silence. After years of war, Europe did not celebrate. It exhaled, a long breath, tired, relieved. Waterloo did not merely end Napoleon. It ended the need to constantly react to him. And in history, that sense of relief is the clearest sign that an era has closed. Leaving Waterloo, Napoleon was no longer a moving legend. He became a memory, beginning to harden. The questions were no longer, will he return? But how will he be remembered? Power, once a living present, shifted into a past that needed to be explained, justified, or warned against. Seen from a distance, Waterloo teaches a quiet lesson. No genius outlasts the era that allows him to exist. Napoleon had exploited to the fullest the historical moment that made him possible. But when that moment passed, clinging to it through sheer will, only made the collision more painful. Power, if it does not know how to stop, will be forced to stop, and usually without mercy. When night fell over that field, there were no more gunshots, only the silence of an era that had just ended, and within that silence Napoleon's story moved into its final chapter, no longer a story of victory or defeat, but a story of memory, of solitude, and of a man who had once reshaped a continent, learning how to live with his own past. In the next part, we will follow Napoleon to St. Helena, where power is no longer a tool, no longer an action, but only a memory. And there, in isolation and reflection, he will carry out his final act of control, shaping how history tells his story. There is a form of power that enters history not with shouting, but with a sigh of relief. It does not smash down old doors, but gently closes those that have been rattling violently in the wind. When Napoleon Bonaparte became first consul of France, power did not appear as a seizure. It appeared as a very simple promise. From now on, things would be stable. After the 18 Brumaire, France no longer had the strength for another political experiment. The people were exhausted by constantly changing constitutions, short-lived governments, and endless calls for sacrifice. In that context, the title First Consul sounded remarkably reasonable. Not a king, not a dictator, just an administrator, a mediator, someone tasked with keeping the wheel of history turning without snapping its axle. Napoleon understood the power of form extremely well. He did not rush to dismantle the language of the Republic. On the contrary, he used it skillfully. A new constitution was promulgated. Plebiscites were organized. Concepts such as the people, stability, and national interest were repeated with great frequency. Everything appeared legal, rational, and above all, reassuring. Power, in Napoleon's hands, did not confront liberty directly. It wore the mask of protecting liberty from chaos. Yet behind that mask, a truth slowly emerged. Power was concentrating, very slowly, very evenly, and almost without noise. Legislative bodies were weakened in the name of efficiency. The press was guided so as not to cause instability. Political opponents were not executed en masse as during the Terror, but were blurred, pushed to the margins, and cut off from the flow of influence. Compared to the open violence of the Revolution, this method was far gentler, and for that very reason, it was more dangerous. Napoleon did not rule through direct fear. He ruled through comparison. Compared to the recent years of chaos, his order looked like a gift. People were not asked what they had lost. They were only reminded of what they had escaped. And in human psychology, relief is often more readily accepted than abstract freedom. As first consul, Napoleon began to reveal clearly the nature of a modern manager of power. He did not seek to control every thought, but to control the structures that rendered those thoughts harmless. Laws were standardized. The administrative apparatus was reorganized. Education, finance, and the military, all were arranged according to the logic of order and efficiency. France gradually became a machine that functioned more smoothly than ever before. And within that machine, Napoleon was the central coordinator. What makes this phase especially aligned with the spirit of deep sleep of power is that power at this point was no longer noisy. It was steady, rhythmic, like breathing after a long fever has finally broken. People grew accustomed to waking up without fearing that there would be a new government, new laws, or a new purge. And, gradually, like a figure retreating into fog, and in that process, power revealed its most fragile form, dependence on the memory of others. Europe, meanwhile, continued forward. New orders were tested, alliances shifted, and slowly Napoleon ceased to be a threat and became a lesson, but not a simple one. He was not merely a warning against ambition. He was proof of how a single individual can shape history when an era opens a crack wide enough. At St. Helena, Napoleon died not as an emperor, but as a man carrying an entire era that had lived too fast. His death caused no great shock. It merely closed a process that had ended long before. But the story did not end. The story continued, because Napoleon's final power lay not in what he did, but in what people continued to say about him. And here, we may pause for a calm assessment. Napoleon lost everything that could be lost, yet retained the rarest thing of all, a lasting presence in human memory. Very few achieve this state, not because they are better, but because they represent a turning point in history that cannot be ignored. In the final part, as the story prepares to close, we will no longer ask whether Napoleon won or lost. We will ask a slower, deeper question. What did France and the modern world become after passing through this man? For there are figures who do not merely live within history, but force history to change its shape in order to contain them. When a story reaches its final passage, what matters most is no longer what happened, but what remains. After all, sounds have faded. The story of Napoleon Bonaparte is no different. It does not close with a clear victory or a definitive defeat, but with a long pause, a silence in which history itself seems to slow down and ask, in the end, what did this man truly leave behind? Napoleon did not save the French Revolution, nor did he simply betray it. He did something more difficult to name. He replaced it. The revolution shattered the old order through emotion, ideals, and the fury of the crowd. Napoleon stepped into the void it left behind with discipline, structure, and efficiency. He transformed chaotic energy into a system. He turned spontaneous violence into concentrated power. And in doing so, he shaped modern France. Not in the way the revolutionaries had dreamed of, but in the way a weary society could accept. If we look back across his entire journey, a clear arc emerges, from a child born on the margins of France to a man standing at the center of Europe, from someone who belonged nowhere to someone around whom everything revolved. Napoleon was not born to rest quietly within history. He was born at the precise moment when history opened a crack, and he stepped into it with rare speed, will, and cold resolve. Not everyone could have done that, and not everyone who could would have been willing to pay the price. That price was not paid only in blood on the battlefield, but in a profound shift in how society came to understand power. After Napoleon, Europe could no longer naively believe that power belonged solely to lineage or to God. But neither could it continue to believe that ideals alone were sufficient to run a nation. The world entered the era of the modern state, where efficiency, law, and administrative machinery became the pillars of governance. Within that world, Napoleon appears not merely as an individual, but as a model. And because he is a model, his legacy resists simple moral judgment. He was both liberator and conqueror, both an organizational genius and a source of prolonged war. The France he left behind was built not only on victory, but on loss. Not only on law, but on the memories of millions who lived, hoped, and sacrificed within his era. In the slow cadence of late night, what invites reflection is not whether Napoleon was right or wrong. History rarely moves according to such simple answers. What matters is how a single individual can fill the void left by a revolution, and the price society is willing to pay for stability after chaos. Napoleon shows us that when people grow exhausted by unformed freedom, they will accept order, even when that order bears the imprint of a single individual. On a deeper level, this story is also a quiet reminder for every era. Those who replace revolutions do not emerge in healthy societies. They appear when old systems collapse, when belief fragments, and when fear outweighs hope. Napoleon was not the sole cause of his time. He was its clearest product. Looking back in the stillness of St. Helena, Napoleon seems to have understood this. His final power was no longer armies or laws, but the way he would be remembered. And that memory, even today, continues to provoke debate. Yet perhaps that very debate is the clearest proof of his stature. Small figures do not force history to argue about them for so long. Now as the story prepares to close, there are no cannons, no commands, only the slow breathing of the night. Napoleon returns to his final place, no longer the man who steered an era, but a mirror into which later generations must look. A mirror reflecting both ambition and limitation, both the capacity to build and the destructive force of concentrated power. And perhaps this is the most fitting moment to let the story go. No judgment, no rigid conclusion, only a quiet thought. History is not made by perfect people, but by people strong enough to alter the direction of the world, even if only for a time. There are some people who are not born to live within history. They are born to become history. As the lights dim and sleep draws near, this story, too, comes to rest, like a slow lullaby, leaving you not with answers, but with a feeling. The sense that power, no matter how vast, is ultimately only one chapter in humanity's longer journey to find order amid chaos.